Members, we turn now to the Civil Defence Emergency Management Bill.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Carmel Sepulveda.
I seek leave for all provisions to be taken as one debate with separate votes taken at the end.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there any objection? There appears to be none. So, members, the question now is that parts 1 and 2, schedules 1 to 3 and clauses 1 and 2 stand part.
Mr. Chair.
Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Pleased to speak in the committee stage of the Civil Defence Emergency Management Amendment Bill, which has been through an extensive select committee process and I think has come back to the House improved, and we certainly support the intent of this bill, which is to improve the way that communities recover from emergencies and for there to be a seamless and timely transition from response to recovery. This is a pretty important piece of legislation within an even more important context, and I don't think anyone would disagree that New Zealand being better prepared and better able to deal with the aftermath of major events is an important thing to do. We note that the bill is in the first stage of a wider review which is being undertaken into the legislative framework for recovery, and one of the issues that we did raise at Select Committee was where is that wider review up to, and that while this is an important piece of legislation in its own right, it's really just one part of the picture, and we are raising questions at the committee stage of the Minister as to the timetable of the wider legislative review and the substance of what that review will involve, and will it involve more legislation coming to the House, and will that be coming to the House within the next 12 months? And I think that's a pretty important question to be dealt with. We raised a number of questions in the issues in the second reading around matters that we had concerns about at Select Committee. Many of those were actually dealt with out at Select Committee, which is always an important thing to happen. One of those was around the RNEs, around the ministerial powers that were being expressed in the original legislation, and how the imbalance between the exercise of ministerial power and the consultation with local communities in the recovery phase of an emergency. Mostly those concerns were allayed to the point where Labor supported the bill as it was coming back to Select Committee. However, I do want to keep on the record that we do remain concerned and watchful that this imbalance doesn't diminish the role of local communities in the recovery phase of an emergency, and that role is critical on the ground, where the local communities and those representing the local communities are empowered to act, and to do so in relationship with the Minister, so that there isn't an imbalance occurring there. I also want to put on record the appreciation of the time taken by officials and the drafting office to ensure that these clauses have been written in a way that is acceptable to all parties, and I do mean that most sincerely, because I deal with a few select committees, and I think that this select committee really, the officials really did go out of their way to ensure that that there was the best outcome possible. A very good select committee, very well chaired by the Honourable Ruth Dyson. I'm signalling tonight that that Labor is putting up a supplementary order paper to address an issue that we also raised in the second reading, which was with regards to a provision that was removed at Select Committee on the inclusion of strategic recovery plans, and it was contained in the original version of the bill at section 57A, which was removed at Select Committee, and we believe that the inclusion of a provision for a strategic recovery plan was a vital element to be included in the actual legislation as an important signal from legislation down through to the, Mr. Chair.
Clear, Karen.
So we believe that those plans were vital for the element of successful recoveries, and we noted that while the bill no longer required civil defence emergency management groups to prepare a separate strategic recovery plan, the function of recovery planning was now integrated into the general statutory function. So that was what the proposal was, for it to be taken out of the legislation and it be included in the general statutory functions of CDM groups and recovery managers. Our concern was that the lack of a specific requirement in the Act raised the risk for poor planning and where those groups were weak. And we know that the civil defence activity around the country in the different groups, that there are different levels of organisation, and our concern was that there should be a requirement in the legislation for strategic recovery planning so that could flow down. The argument from some of the submitters was that there wasn't enough detail and that therefore there needed to be more specific detail as to what should be included. And I think the remedy proposed by officials was to remove that function altogether. We remained concerned, and so that is what the essence of the SOP before the House tonight is. We understand that this is supported by the government, and if that is the case, then we believe that's very cooperative and good outcome. The SOP essentially inserts at clause, and this is in part 1, Mr. Chair, in clause 2, it affects clause 2, clause 7 and clause 19, and it inserts a section at clause 19 which requires strategic planning for recovery from the hazards and risks, and we believe that at least gives a legislative requirement which will address the concerns that we had about that lack of signal coming from legislation. So our concerns on that have been allayed. We had original concerns around the ministerial powers, and that leaves ultimately, Mr. Chair, the concerns around what's left out and the bits of the puzzle that haven't been dealt with, and these are the large-scale events and response readiness, and we think that while this bill addresses important recovery issues, that those bits have not been addressed, and while there has been a commitment by the Minister to a second stage of legislative review focusing on large-scale emergencies, there's no evidence of this occurring into the short and medium term, and we therefore believe that leaves the country with a problem. So in the committee stage of the House tonight, we are hoping that there will be some indication from the government as to what the next stage will be and when that will occur, because while focusing on recovery is important, so is response readiness, and we believe that in every community around New Zealand, some more than others, that community responsiveness to large-scale events is critical. And This bill makes clear that it's focused on the small to medium-sized events. Those small to medium-sized events do ultimately result in quite massive costs to the country and to communities. So leaving out the issue around where we're going with the large-scale events is pretty important. So we're pretty pleased tonight to be putting this SOP on the table. We hope that it will receive support across the House. It provides an important signal in legislation that all groups, civil defence, emergency management groups around the country must be developing strategic recovery plans, and the Ministry will be providing guidelines for how they will occur.
Mr. Chair.